Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this event, which is the latest one put on by the Conspiracy and Democracy Research Project. For those of you who are new to this, this is a 5-year Leave a Hume funded research project based in Crash on conspiracy and democracy. The project has 3 strands: a historical one led by Richard Evans, a political theory strand led by David Runciman, and an internet strand led by me. And one of the things we have done from the outset of the project is we have had an ambitious program of public lectures like this one. Now, from the outside of the project, we faced an interesting problem, which was that the subject of conspiracy theorizing and conspiracist thinking is very disreputable among right-thinking people, particularly in academic life, where conspiracy theories are viewed with a certain degree of well-bred contempt. They are the product of people who wear tinfoil hats, or who suffer from what Cass Sunstein calls a crippled epistemology. So we had to work quite hard to establish that something as widespread in human society as conspiracy theorizing was something worth examining seriously. And I think, broadly speaking, 2.5 years in, or whatever it is, we have established at least that this is a subject of great interest and of great importance. Its importance has just been amplified a bit by the fact that a leading proponent of conspiracy theories of various kinds of craziness may well turn out to be the next president of the United States. So you can imagine how pleased we were some time ago when this book appeared, because the book simply it argued that in fact there's nothing all that weird about conspiracy theorizing. In fact, it argued that human beings have an inbuilt tendency towards what you might call conspiracist thinking. That's to say, they have inbuilt cognitive biases which may have an evolutionary function which leads us as people to, as animals, to see patterns in things and so on. And this for us was rather a cheery kind of discovery that there was somebody thinking in this way. And so we have tonight a guy who claims to be the author of this here book. When a journalist interviewed him a while back, the first question was, "How do I know you're the real Ron Brotherton?" And the reply was, "You'll just have to take my word for it." Well, I'm prepared to take his word for it. You may be too. But in any event, we're stuck with him for the evening, as it were. Rob, I hope you'll talk for maybe 40 minutes, and then afterwards my colleague Alfred Moore will respond, and then we'll turn it over to the room for a conversation. So thank you for coming.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And first of all, thank you very much to everybody at the project for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here and to be a small part of such an interesting and productive project. And thank you all for coming tonight. So I am a science writer. I wrote a book called Suspicious Minds: Why We Believe Conspiracy Theories. But my day job is I'm an academic psychologist. And so I'd like to begin with a thought experiment. I'd like you to play along, if you would. I want you to imagine that it's the late 1960s. So the Cold War is heating up. The space race is reaching a crescendo. I'd like you to imagine that you work for NASA, and you are part of the team that's been tasked with putting man on the moon. Towards the beginning of the decade, President Kennedy had said that by the end of the decade, the United States would put man on the moon, not because it was easy, but because it was hard. But imagine that it turns out that it's really hard, much harder than anybody had anticipated. Suppose it's going to take years, at least, to put people on the moon, get them back safely. So this is bad news. This looks bad for the United States. The Soviets already put the first satellite in space. They already put the first human in space, and it looks like they're going to beat us to the moon as well. Bad news. But then suppose orders come down from above. We've changed the plan. We're going to fake the moon landing. So we've already booked the soundstage, we've rented the fake moon rock, Stanley Kubrick's agreed to direct. Nobody will ever know. So I want you to imagine all this is true and ask yourself, would you do it? Would you take part in a conspiracy to fake the moon landing? Should we do a show of hands? Is anybody willing to admit that they would fake the moon landing? Few people, impressive. The thing about this kind of question is that the people who really would probably aren't going to admit it in front of a room of strangers, right? So we don't really know the answer. But that's the thought experiment. This is based on a study that was published a few years ago by psychologists at University of Kent, Professor Karen Douglas and Robbie Sutton. And this is essentially what they asked their participants to do. Imagine that under the circumstances, would you have faked the moon landing? For good measure, they also asked, would you have killed Princess Diana? Would you fake climate change data? Would you manufacture the AIDS virus? And would you cover up the existence of extraterrestrials? If you find yourself in the circumstances, would you take part in these conspiracies? And reassuringly, most of the people who took part in the study said that they wouldn't, under any circumstances, wouldn't dream of it. But there were a few people who said that they might be willing to take part in these kind of conspiracies. And there was an interesting thing about those people who said that they might be willing to conspire, because the researchers also asked, not only would you take part in these conspiracies, but do you think the conspiracy theories are true? Do you think the moon landing really was faked? Do you think Princess Diana was killed by the Queen or somebody? And the interesting thing was that the people who said, yeah, I reckon the moon landing might be true, the hoax might be true, they were the people who said, yeah, I'm maybe more willing to take part in a conspiracy like that. There's a correlation between willingness to conspire and belief in the conspiracy theories. And so what the authors of the study argue is that this reflects a psychological tendency that we call projection. When it comes to conspiracy theories like these, we don't have firm facts, so we can't just look in like the history books and stuff like that. So we have to look elsewhere. When we're judging how plausible or implausible a conspiracy theory is, we have to look elsewhere. And one of the things that we can do in uncertain situations like this is we can think about ourselves and think about other people. And we tend to project our own personal tendencies and beliefs onto other people. And so the people who think, would I take part in this conspiracy under the circumstances? Maybe yeah. Then they project that belief, that tendency outwards onto everybody else. They think the world is full of budding conspirators. And so then the logic runs that if the world is full of potential conspirators, then it's more likely that historically some of these people have gone through with the conspiracies. It's more likely that the moon landing really was faked. And so this is one psychological finding that has emerged recently from the literature. The investigation of the psychology behind conspiracy theories has only really begun. It's only taken off within the last 5 or 10 years or so. But this is one of the findings that's emerged, and there are various other interesting psychological findings that we've discovered over the last few years. And later on in the talk, I'll give a quick overview of some of those findings. But first of all, I think it's worth thinking about a more basic issue. Just what do we mean when we say conspiracy theory? What do we mean when we use that label? And so I'd like to show you two claims, two statements, and I'd ask you to think about whether you think they deserve the label conspiracy theory. So first of all, if you can read it at the back, this says, members of the United States government planned and executed the 9/11 attacks. Do you think we should call that a conspiracy theory? Some people, some nods. Here's another statement. Members of Al-Qaeda planned and executed the 9/11 attacks. Do you think we should call that a conspiracy theory?
Yes.
Some people? A little bit more split over that one? Yeah, so this is what I find when I ask audiences. Most people would agree that saying the US government did 9/11, that is a conspiracy theory. But when it comes to saying that Al-Qaeda did 9/11, it's a little bit more split. Most people say that we probably shouldn't call that a conspiracy theory. Some people say yes. But the point is that, well, what is the difference between these two statements? They're virtually identical, right, on the surface of it. The only difference between them is in the villain, who is allegedly responsible for this conspiracy. Well, they both postulate conspiracies, right? They both say that a successful conspiracy took place. And yet, there's a division of opinion. Some people say that one of these claims we should call a conspiracy theory, the other one we shouldn't. And so when it comes to using this label, how we define a conspiracy theory, it must be something a little bit deeper. It must be something below the surface, right? It must be something in the logic, the structure, the evidence behind the claims that causes some people to call one a conspiracy theory, but not another. And so this issue of defining conspiracy theory is often kind of glossed over, especially within the psychological literature. People don't really tend to think too much about the definition, and I think that's because we all have kind of an intuitive definition, right? When we hear the term conspiracy theory, we know what people are talking about. We all kind of know one when we see one. But as those two statements illustrate, I hope you'll understand it's a little bit more tricky than that. And so in my book, Suspicious Minds, I spend a chapter thinking about the definition, what is a conspiracy theory? And I think that there isn't really a precise, succinct definition, because there are too diverse a category of explanations for things. But I think there are features, there are characteristics that we can look for that can help us identify conspiracy theories, or explain why some claims are called conspiracy theories, but not others. And so these are some of the features that I think are important. First, there are a couple of features of the alleged conspirators. And so we can ask, are the conspirators unusually evil? Part of what makes defining conspiracy theory tricky is that we know conspiracies do occur in the world, right? There are real conspiracies, nobody's arguing that. But in the real world, the motives of the conspirators, their intent, what they want to achieve with their conspiracy tends to be fairly limited, right? And fairly petty. It tends to be they want to make some money for themselves, increase their paycheck, stuff like that. But when it comes to at least prototypical conspiracy theories, they usually go pretty far beyond that. They allege, at the very least, that the conspirators have a kind of pathological disregard for individual well-being and liberty. And at the other end of the spectrum, they propose that there's this all-encompassing global conspiracy to enslave us all or kill us all off. So I think it's fair to say that that is unusually evil. And a second feature that I think we should look for is, are they unusually competent? Are they unusually good at conspiring? Again, conspiracies happen in the world, but at least the ones that we know about, they don't tend to stay secret for very long because people can't keep secrets that well. It's difficult to plan and execute such complex conspiracies like that. And yeah, in the world of conspiracy theory, the conspirators, the alleged conspirators, are usually able to make and execute these elaborate plans perfectly, keep it secret afterwards. And so I think it's fair to say that they are unusually competent. Other features I think we should look for have to do with the evidence that is used to support conspiracy theories. And so we can ask, is it based on anomaly hunting? By which I mean that conspiracy theories, prototypical conspiracy theories, they're usually not based on solid, what we call positive evidence. Rather, they're based on finding anomalies, things, observations that don't immediately seem to fit with what they often call the official story, and then filling in the gaps, tracing the connections between the dots into the outline of a conspiracy. We can also ask, is it unproven? And I think this might be one of the more nuanced and easily misunderstood features, because there's a lot of people seem to use the label in the sense that a conspiracy theory is a claim that is false, right? It's demonstrably false. Sometimes they use it to say that a claim is ridiculous, that we shouldn't even entertain it. And so there's this common perception, or common usage, I think, that says conspiracy theories are false. But that's problematic if you think about it for a while, because false according to who, right? We're just kind of offsetting the question of who is the authority that we should outsource this question of whether this theory is true to. And, you know, in the world of conspiracy theories, people don't often trust authorities that much. So it's kind of problematic. But that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that the claims have not lived up to some external scientific criteria of proof. I'm saying something a bit more nuanced, which is that woven into the claims themselves is they're saying that they are unproven currently, that there is a conspiracy that's still ongoing in some sense. It hasn't been fully revealed, and therefore inherently conspiracy theories are unproven. They're saying that there's something that we don't know. They're always looking just over the horizon, around the next corner. They're inherently speculative. And finally, another feature of the logic of conspiracy theories is that they can't be proven to be false. This is a different issue from being unproven. This is saying that there's no evidence that we could discover from the world that could prove a conspiracy theory to be false, because they're inherently speculative. They're saying we don't know something. It's very hard to prove a negative. Right? And so any evidence that we would find in the world, if it seems to be consistent with the conspiracy theory, well, that's great, right? That's proof of the conspiracy. If there's evidence that seems to go against the conspiracy, well, that's what we'd expect, because the conspirators are trying to throw us off the trail. They're throwing out disinformation to mislead us. And if there's just no evidence at all, well, again, we'd expect that, because they're covering it up, right? That just means they're doing their job. And so in that sense, there's no way that we can prove a conspiracy theory to be false. Now, I would point out that this feature of unfalsifiability and all the other features I mentioned, they don't mean that a claim that demonstrates these features is necessarily false. It could still be true, even if it's unfalsifiable, even if it's unproven. Sometimes conspiracies do turn out to be true. But I think it's fair to say that the more of these features and the more that they demonstrate, more that the claim demonstrates these features, the more skeptical we should be, right? So I think that's, again, it's not a perfect definition, but I think it's useful. It lets us know roughly what we're looking at when we call something a conspiracy theory. And then secondly, now that we know what we're talking about, another issue that's worth thinking about, a basic issue, is just why should we care about conspiracy theories? Why do we need to fund projects that research conspiracy theories? What's the harm if people want to believe unproven, unfalsifiable theories about unusually evil, competent conspirators? Why should we care? But there are a couple of reasons why I think it's important to understand conspiracy theories. And one of the reasons is just that they're so prevalent, much more so than people think. There's a stereotype of conspiracy theorists as being, a handful of deluded kooks in their parents' basements, on obscure internet forums, wearing tinfoil hats. But this stereotype really doesn't hold up. There have been quite a few surveys over the years looking at how many people agree with various conspiracy theories, and the numbers vary between surveys, but they're consistently quite high. So for example, 57%, over half of people claim to believe that other people were involved in the assassination of JFK. Again, this figure has varied over the years from around 9 out of 10 Americans to around half of Americans, something like that. But it's a substantial proportion. Often, a majority of people think there was a conspiracy behind the assassination of JFK. A little bit over a third of people say that they think climate change is a scientific fraud. Again, around a third of people think that the government, United States government, allowed or assisted the 9/11 attacks. Around a fifth of people think the government's covering up aliens. 42% of people think that the government knew about Pearl Harbor in advance. A little bit over a quarter of people think that there's a secretive power elite with a globalist agenda conspiring to rule the world, this New World Order idea. And according to this survey, asking about whether lizard people control our societies, position themselves in positions of power, 4% of Americans agreed with that statement, according to one survey. A further 7% said they just weren't sure whether that's true or not. These figures are all from the States, but it's a kind of similar proportion of people in Britain who believe these kind of conspiracy theories. And so again, the point is that they are widespread. It's not just people in tinfoil hats, it's pretty much everybody who's receptive to one conspiracy theory or another, and often people are receptive to many different conspiracy theories. Again, I should point out that I don't want to give a false sense of precision with these precise percentages. The exact number of people who believe any conspiracy theory varies between surveys, depending on exactly how you ask the question and who you're asking, when you're asking them. But conspiracy theories are widespread, and that's one reason why I think it's important to understand where they come from. There must be something psychologically interesting going on here. But another reason why I think it's important to understand conspiracy theories is that sometimes they can have consequences. They can influence people's decisions, their behavior, how they live their lives. And one example of a conspiracy theory having consequences has to do with vaccines. I'm sure you've all heard the idea that the MMR vaccine causes autism. This idea surfaced in the late 1990s thanks to a British doctor called Andrew Wakefield. No longer a doctor, he had his medical license withdrawn in the UK. But he claimed to have found evidence that the MMR vaccine was somehow damaging the intestines of children and traveling through their bloodstreams into their brain and causing autism. His data didn't support that. In fact, it's since been withdrawn by the journal it was published in, but he went to the media. The claims got a lot of attention. It became the most widely covered news story of the early 2000s in the British media. And conspiracy theories have surrounded this idea since it emerged, saying that doctors know about this harm and that they're covering it up, or the government's covering it up to ensure profits for the medical industry. Conspiracy theories have helped the idea to persist long after it's been shown to be false. There are many large, well-conducted studies that show there's no link between the MMR vaccine or any other vaccine and autism. What you might not know is that this wasn't the first time that conspiracy theories had surrounded vaccines. In fact, over the years, Basically, every vaccine that's been used has been accused of causing some kind of harm, often with conspiracy theories surrounding it. So, for example, the pertussis vaccine was accused of causing epilepsy. The pneumococcus vaccine has been accused of causing diabetes. Hepatitis B vaccine has been accused of causing sudden infant death syndrome. HPV of causing blood clots. And going all the way back to the very first vaccine, the smallpox vaccine, there were people at the time who claimed that the smallpox vaccine would turn you into a cow. That people who received it would start growing horns and scurrying around on all fours and mooing like a cow. And this wasn't some kind of metaphor. There were people who literally said this was true, that you would start growing horns. This is an etching from the British Museum of a lady who received the smallpox vaccine and allegedly grew horns. And this might sound quaint and ridiculous to us, right? The idea that a vaccine could cause you to turn into a cow. But it's been pointed out by medical experts like Dr. Paul Offit, who's written about anti-vaccinationists, that the claim that the MMR vaccine somehow damages children's intestines, travels through their blood, damages their brain, is exactly as plausible, biologically speaking, as the claim that the smallpox vaccine can turn you into a cow. Which is to say, not biologically plausible at all. And there's no evidence behind it, but the conspiracy theories can help these kind of ideas to survive long after they've been disproved. So anti-vaccine conspiracy theories are one example of conspiracy theories having tangible consequences. Another example has to do with terrorism and violence. So there have been quite a few examples of people who have been influenced by their belief in a government conspiracy to take action against that conspiracy. People like Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, who bombed a federal building in the 1990s, Anders Breivik, who shot dozens of children, and the Tsarnaev brothers, who carried off the Boston bombing. All these people were people who thought that there was some kind of government conspiracy and that they were fighting against that conspiracy. So the vaccine conspiracy theories and the decisions people make based off them, I think that's based on people's concern for themselves and the people who they're closest to. But some conspiracy theories have a darker side. These conspiracy theories are based on our fears and our prejudices of other people. And there's no better example of conspiracy theories motivating people to take drastic action than anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, which have been around for centuries. Almost since the advent of Christianity, there have been anti-Semitic conspiracy theories saying that Jewish people were poisoning Christian drinking wells or that they were abducting Christian babies. These ideas, these conspiracy theories have swirled around for centuries, and they kind of came to a head with a pamphlet called The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, which, if you haven't heard of it, it was a pamphlet emerged in the early 1900s that was allegedly a transcript of a meeting that occurred between Jewish elites who were planning their conspiracy for world domination. They were outlining their plan, basically, for how they were going to enslave the world. It was a fraud, obviously. There was no such meeting, no such elders of Zion. It was a fraud, but the Protocols of Zion kind of swept Europe, especially in between the First World War and the Second World War, gained a lot of traction. And Adolf Hitler was an admirer of the Protocols of Zion. He talked about Jewish people, on the one hand, in disparaging terms. He compared them to rodents and things like that. But on the other hand, he also saw the Jewish people as kind of a metaphysical enemy of the Aryan race. And he saw things coming to a head. Either the Aryan race was going to die off, killed by the Jewish people, or vice versa. And that's why he had to implement his final solution. And so again, conspiracy theories can have consequences. And that's why we need to understand where they come from, how they gain traction, why certain people are more likely to believe them. And so this leads me towards the psychology, some of the findings that have emerged over the last few years. And so to illustrate the first finding I want to talk about, I want to show you a video, first of all. This video is from a classic study in social psychology from the 1940s. And all I want to say about it before I show you is that in the original study, participants just viewed the video. There was no audio accompaniment. But for our purposes, to enhance some dramatic tension, I've added some musical accompaniment. So it lasts about a minute or so. Please watch this video.
Ricordo dir ancora
Good. My music didn't seem to work for some reason, which is a pity. It was this kind of dramatic operatic score that reaches a crescendo when the triangle's smashing up the house. But anyway, doesn't matter. So, like I said, this was a classic study from social psychology from the 1940s. The researchers, because of technological limitations at the time, they had to cut these shapes out of cardboard and animate it one frame at a time. And they put together this video. And they showed it to 34 participants, 34 people, with no further explanation. They just asked them to watch this video and to describe what you see, to write down what you see happening on the screen. And one of their participants described it in purely abstract geometric terms. They said the circle enters the rectangle, a big triangle appears on the scene, and so on. The other 34 participants, they didn't just describe it as shapes moving around a screen, they described it as a story. They described the shapes as characters in this story. They described the shapes as having motives and personalities and acting out some kind of story. Some of the participants said it was like kids playing in a playground chasing each other. One participant, I think, said it was like a witch tempting two little kids into her house. And so what this demonstrates is that our brains are finely attuned to signs of intent. We're always looking for motives, trying to figure out what people are up to. And all it takes sometimes is just a few abstract shapes moving around a screen, and we see it in terms of human motives and intent. No, I'm not saying that it's wrong for us to do that. I mean, the researchers designed this video pretty carefully. They scripted the whole thing out. In fact, in their own paper, they describe it in anthropomorphic terms of like a triangle chasing a circle and stuff like that. They deliberately designed it to be like characters acting out a story. But the point is that that's all it takes, as little as it takes. Just some shapes moving around a screen in a way that vaguely resembles some kind of human action. And we begin to interpret it in terms of human motives and intent. And so we saw at the very start of the talk this projection bias. So when we want to figure out why something happened, we project our own beliefs and tendencies into other people. But when we're trying to explain something, there's a more basic question we have to answer first, which is, was this event intended, or was it just an accident? Was it chance? And so what this kind of experiment suggests is that we have this bias towards assuming things were intended, rather than just seeing meaningless action taking place on a screen. And so this very same video that I showed you a moment ago, this was used in an experiment recently, last year, again by Karen Douglas and colleagues. They showed people this video, and instead of asking them just to freely describe what they saw, they asked them to rate on a scale from 1 to 7, how conscious do you think the shapes are? How alive do you think they are? Questions like that. And then, in an ostensibly unrelated questionnaire, they asked them about conspiracy theories, various popular conspiracy theories. How plausible do you think these are? And then they compared the scores, and they found that there was a positive correlation. The more people saw these shapes as being alive and conscious, the more likely they were to buy into conspiracy theories, which is interesting. And so I ran another study looking at a similar idea, along with my colleague Chris French at Goldsmiths. A similar idea, but we used quite a different method to look at this same question. What we did was we showed participants a set of 12 ambiguous sentences, things like these. She kicked the dog, he set the house on fire, she popped the balloon. So these sentences are deliberately designed to be ambiguous in as much as they could be describing something that happened on purpose, or they could be describing something that was an accident, right? Maybe she was really angry and the dog was under her feet, so she kicked it out of the way. Or maybe she was like carrying some laundry and didn't see the dog underneath her and tripped over it, right? Could be intended, could be accidental. And so what we did was we asked people to read these sentences, describe whatever comes to mind, and then we counted up the number of sentences that people had interpreted as intended. And again, we asked people about various conspiracy theories, and we compared the numbers. We found that the more of these ambiguous sentences people interpreted as intended, the more likely they were to buy into conspiracy theories. And so, again, this is interesting, and it makes sense, because conspiracy theories are painting a world in which basically nothing happens by accident. The conspirators are in control of everything. And so if you have this bias, if you're more susceptible to this intentionality bias, and you're more likely to be receptive to claims that paint events, ambiguous events from the world, as having been intended by some kind of conspiracy. And this goes back to one of the features that I mentioned in our definition of a conspiracy theory. They paint this world in which the conspirators are unusually competent, they can make and execute these elaborate plans. Again, nothing happens by accident. The conspirators are in control of everything. So the intentionality bias is one psychological quirk that might lead us towards conspiracy theories. Another finding that's emerged from the literature concerns what we call the proportionality bias. And basically what it says is that when something big happens in the world, we assume there must have been a proportionally big cause. When something small happens, we kind of assume something small probably caused it, right? And so this proportionality bias might influence people to believe conspiracy theories, in as much as conspiracy theories tend to pertain to big, significant, momentous events from the world. Things like the assassination of presidents, disappearing airplanes, terrorist attacks, things like that. And so it might be the case that something so big happens in the world, we don't want to think, or our brains tell us that it can't be the case that something small caused that. We become more receptive to explanations that involve bigger ideas, like a grand conspiracy that's been going on throughout time, involving dozens or hundreds or thousands of people. And so this has been demonstrated in quite a few experiments now, using fictitious scenarios like made-up newspaper reports of the death of presidents or airplane accidents. And keeping all things equal, people are more likely to interpret these kind of events as the result of conspiracy when the outcome is bigger. So when the president dies versus if the president survives, or if the airplane crashes and kills many people versus if it manages to land safely. All else being equal, people prefer bigger explanations for bigger events. And I think a perfect example of this from the real world concerns the assassination of JFK. As we saw, this is one of the most widely believed conspiracy theories. More than half of people usually, according to surveys, think there was a conspiracy behind the assassination of JFK. It's interesting to compare it to the failed assassination of Ronald Reagan, right? The thing about that is that nobody thinks it was a conspiracy. There have never been conspiracy theories either at the time or since alleging that there was a conspiracy behind this failed attempted assassination on Ronald Reagan. And so I think if the outcome had been different, if President Kennedy had have somehow survived, or if Reagan had have died, which he very nearly did, he was only saved by the doctors who were treating him, then we might have seen something very different. We might have seen more conspiracy theories about the assassination of Reagan and fewer about the attempted assassination of Kennedy, because of this proportionality bias. And so the last psychological tendency I want to talk about is our ability to find patterns in the world. We're constantly finding dots and connecting them together. And we can easily see this in terms of visual illusions, right? Things like this. This is called the Kanitsa triangle. It's one of my favorite visual illusions. All it is like three Pac-Man kind of shape, these circles with segments missing, and three angles. But what we see is not just those incomplete shapes. We see two triangles and three circles, right? Complete shapes, one white triangle on top with no outline, overlapping a triangle on the bottom with this black outline, and three complete circles that are eclipsed by the angles of the triangles, right? But that's not there at all. It's just incomplete shapes. The most amazing thing, I don't know how well this works on the screen, but you can almost see the edges of the white triangle with no outline, right? It looks like a different shade of white almost. It looks whiter than white, but it's not. It's the exact same color pixels. Our brain is just interpreting it. It's filling in the dots, connecting the dots, and telling us that these are complete shapes that are overlapping. And so this tendency to find patterns, to see meaning, again, it might relate to conspiracy theories. This has been investigated in one of the first experiments was by Jennifer Whitson and Adam Galinsky in 2008. They ran a series of experiments. One of them involved literally connecting the dots. They used these visual stimuli, which are noisy, they visual static, these blobs, and there are images hidden within the static. Like in this case, you can probably make out like a Saturn kind of shape, right? This is another one. Can anybody see the shape in that? No, there's nothing there. It's just purely visual, random visual static. There's nothing in there. But what they found is that people oftentimes, when they were kind of rushed a little bit, they would report seeing images in this random static. They would see faces or animals, buildings, things like that, even though objectively there's nothing there. Their brain would connect the dots. They would see something there. And they were especially likely to do this when the researchers manipulated their sense of control. When people were made to feel like they don't have control over their own lives, over circumstances, they became more likely to see patterns in these kind of visual stimuli. So that was one experiment they did. They also did other experiments where they used like data from the stock market or like superstitious stories, things like that. Again, people were likely to find illusory patterns. But for our purposes, the most interesting thing is they used another scenario involving a conspiracy. This story that might have been explained by conspiracy or it might have been chance. Again, a lot of people were likely to perceive a conspiracy in this ambiguous scenario. And again, they were more likely to when they were made to feel like they didn't have much control over their circumstances. So my favorite example of finding a pattern in the real world and it leading some people to perceive a conspiracy involves something called the Umbrella Man. Has anybody heard of the Umbrella Man? A few people. It's not that well known, but we can find him in the Zapruder film, which is very famous. I assume most people have seen it. The Zapruder film starts with, as we saw, some police motorbikes coming around the corner. Abraham Zapruder, who filmed it, he was just testing out his camera, make sure it works, before the motorcade came by, and there's an abrupt cut, and we see the JFK motorcade going down the street. Everything seems normal, everybody seems pretty relaxed and happy. JFK's waving to the crowd, spectators are happy to see him. Then we get to this point in the video, and a street sign comes between the camera and the motorcade, so JFK goes out of vision for a moment. And then when he emerges again, it's clear that something's wrong. He's kind of clutching his throat in this unnatural way. And the video goes on. Very shortly, there's the gruesome headshot. There's like a cloud of blood and brains emerges from his head. His wife, Jackie, is panic-stricken. She climbs over the back of the car, and the motorcade speeds off. And I think a lot of people have seen this video so much that it's just kind of become like a thing. We've all seen it, we all know it, but if you really watch it, it's horrifying and haunting. So I'm not going to play that part of it. But what we're interested in for our purposes today, we can see in this frame of the video. It's not entirely obvious, but if you look closely, right here, emerging in front of the sign, we can see like half of a black umbrella. Everybody see that? And so this is odd because earlier that morning it had been raining, it wasn't a very nice day, but it cleared up, and by the time the motorcade was going through Dealey Plaza, it was a bright sunny day. It was pretty windy, so it wasn't umbrella weather, and nobody, either by Dealey Plaza or along the rest of the motorcade route, was holding an open umbrella. This was the only open umbrella, seemingly, in Dallas, and it happened to be right beside the president at the moment that he got shot. And so this seems odd. Some people noticed this. And it's not an illusion or anything. He really was there. You can see him in this photograph. Here's another one. Just about the moment that the motorcade went by him, this guy holding up this open umbrella. And so people noticed this, and they thought, that's strange. Why is this guy right next to the motorcade at the moment of the assassination holding this open umbrella? Doesn't make any sense. And it gets even stranger because he wasn't just standing there with the umbrella. In fact, he was kind of like hoisting it up and down, twirling it around a little bit. If we go between these two pictures, you can see here it's kind of close to his head. Here he's holding it aloft in a kind of strange way. And eyewitnesses saw the guy before the motorcade went through. He was kind of milling about. He looked like an ordinary guy wearing a suit, holding an umbrella, closed, put away. Then he opened it and was twirling it around as the motorcade went by. Afterwards, he put it away, strolled off. And he wasn't questioned by the police at the time. Nobody knew who he was. For a long time, he just kind of got away. And shortly, people noticed this umbrella. They started asking questions, why would this be here? And for some people, they thought maybe he's part of a conspiracy. Maybe he was signaling to the assassins, maybe signaling that it's the right time to shoot, or that the shot was successful, it found its mark. Other people thought that maybe he had a more active role in the conspiracy. They thought maybe his umbrella was the weapon used to assassinate the president. Maybe it contained some kind of concealed projectile firing mechanism. Maybe he was the assassin. And of course, this would implicate like government agencies, probably the CIA, who would have had to design something like this, right? And so for a long time, people spotted this anomaly, this dot, and they connected it into a wider conspiracy. They asked, what could this guy have been doing? The only possible explanation is that he was part of a conspiracy, right? They spotted this anomaly and concocted a conspiracy theory around it. And so again, this is one of our features that I mentioned in our definition of conspiracy theories. Are based on anomaly hunting, finding these things that don't immediately make sense, and creating conspiracy theories out of them. And, you know, in this case, it seems kind of reasonable, right? What else could it have been doing? Why is this umbrella there? We couldn't possibly know the answer. And so a conspiracy is kind of as good a guess as any, right? But fortunately for us, we know the answer because the US government tracked this guy down. They found the umbrella man for the purposes of the 1970s Select Committee on Assassinations, where they were reinvestigating the Kennedy assassination. They wanted to know what this umbrella man was up to, and so they put out adverts in newspapers asking, does anybody know this guy? If you do, let us know. And they found him this way. A friend of his came across this thing in the newspaper. They called up the government and said, I think this is my friend, Louis. And so the government tracked him down. They hauled him in front of this committee on assassinations. They asked him, did you assassinate the president? And he said, no. They asked him, like, were you part of a conspiracy? Were you signaling somebody? And he said, no. It turns out what he is he was an insurance salesman who lived in Dallas at the time of the assassination. And he really was there. He was standing by the motorcade with this umbrella as the president went by, as he got shot. He claimed he wasn't involved. Even though this was like 15, 16 years after the assassination, he still had the umbrella, remarkably. So you can see Louis Stephen Witt sitting here. You can see the umbrella in front of him. And so, of course, the government didn't take his word for it. They didn't kill the president. They wanted to see the umbrella, right? They asked, did you have a gun in there? They got a staffer of the committee to pick up the umbrella and open it. The committee chairman made a joke as she was opening the umbrella. He said, maybe you should point it that way, pointing towards the press. And she opened it up and it kind of splayed itself inside out obligingly. And that got a laugh. And there was no gun in there. It was just a regular umbrella. And the chairman concluded, well, I guess there's no gun in it. But of course they asked him, so what were you doing? Why were you acting this way with this umbrella? And so he explained. He explained that the black umbrella was a symbol of appeasement. During World War II, Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister's policy of appeasement towards the Nazis, had become the symbol of appeasement because Neville Chamberlain was noted for carrying around a black umbrella. And JFK's father, Joseph Kennedy, had been the British ambassador during the run-up to World War II, so he was associated with Neville Chamberlain. By association, the black umbrella became kind of a sore spot with the Kennedy family. And so Louis Stephen Witt, he didn't even really care about Kennedy, or as a person, he didn't care about his policies that much. He just explained that, like Louis Stephen Witt, I'm kind of a conservative kind of guy. He knew that Kennedy was kind of a liberal kind of guy. And he had a black umbrella to hand. The president was coming through town. He just figured he would go. He would take his umbrella with him, twirl it around as kind of a mild, obscure heckle to Kennedy. He wanted Kennedy to see it, be a little bit upset. That was all there was to it. And unfortunately for Louis Stephen Witt, the president just happened to be assassinated at the very same moment. He explained to the committee that if there was a Guinness World Record for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, doing the wrong thing, he would have won, and there wouldn't have been any close runners-up. And so this is a perfect example, I think, of how truth can be stranger than fiction, right? We couldn't have guessed, nobody could have guessed this explanation. It's too obscure. And so the conspiracy theories kind of made sense. They were a reasonable guess until we knew the correct explanation. The American writer John Updike, he wrote about the Umbrella Man back in 1967. So this was before the Select Committee on Assassinations, before we knew the real answer. Not long after people had first spotted this umbrella in the Zapruder film. He wrote about it in a Talk of the Town column for The New Yorker. And it's a beautiful piece of writing. It's eloquent and insightful, I think. This is a short excerpt from it. He said, "The truth about those seconds in Dallas is especially elusive. The search for it seems to demonstrate how perilously empiricism verges on magic." And I always thought that was just a beautiful sentence and insightful too. Because when it comes to our psychology and our attempt to understand the world, seeking patterns, connecting dots, is one of our most important fundamental abilities. We rely on it every moment of the day, whether we want to explain like the cycle of the seasons, or when crops grow best, or like what brand of cat food our cat prefers, or if we want to come up with like an insightful metaphor or analogy. This all relies on finding connections, on meaningful patterns. And science, too, relies on finding patterns, on looking at data, trying to find patterns in it, and trying to decide which ones are real and which ones are just randomness. And so we do this all the time, and it's one of our brain's best, most important abilities. But the price that we pay for having a brain that's biased towards finding meaning and seeing patterns is that sometimes we see patterns even when they aren't there, even when it's just randomness, chaos, chance. And given our other biases that I talked about, projection bias, the bias to see intent rather than accident, the proportionality bias, I think it's not that surprising that sometimes our brain tells us that a conspiracy has occurred, whether one has or not. So, like I said, I wrote this book. It's called Suspicious Minds. That's what it looks like. You can follow me on Twitter. I have a website called Conspiracy Psychology. I want to say thanks again to the project for inviting me. Thanks to the ESRC for funding some of my research. Thanks to Bloomsbury for publishing my book. Thanks again for your attention. And we'll have a Q&A in a moment.
Thank you very much. Alfred?
Yeah. Thanks, Rob. That was excellent, a fascinating talk, and I love great examples. It's and shows some of the richness of the work that's going on in psychology at the moment. That's getting to this question of why people believe in conspiracy theories. And as you're about to find out, I'm not a psychologist. I just have a few. But because so much of the psychology work has been coming out, as you say, in the last 5 years, we've been seeing a lot of it in our project. I suppose so I've got a couple of questions that really get around, I just want to understand a little bit better some of the aspects of this work. So one of the papers that was most widely reported was one by your colleague Karen Douglas and another colleague, called Dead and Alive, How People Believe Contradictory Conspiracy Theories. And the idea was that one of the findings was that people who believe one conspiracy theory are more likely to believe another, and that this extended even to believing conspiracy theories that seemed contradictory. So believing that Diana had been assassinated and believing that she wasn't actually dead at all, that something else had gone on. And so, to a sort of smug intellectual type like me, this gives me a nice chuckle and, aren't people foolish? But it also makes me think, well, what are we getting at here? What do we mean when we say somebody believes a conspiracy theory? And because the baseline of a great deal of this and political science and a lot of our empirical work on it is survey research. What is going on when people say agree, mildly agree, strongly agree, and so on, to some question about a conspiracy theory? Are they assenting to the truth of a proposition in some strong sense, or are they doing something else? And it puts me in mind of some work from political science on survey responses, in the related context of misinformation, where they would ask people, to answer survey questions. They were about sort of empirical questions. So they'd ask about how big is the national debt right now, and then when they asked self-identified Republicans, and this was under the Obama administration, they would sort of say that it was worse than it was. And you had this sort of partisan bias in judging the state of the economy. And then they said, okay, you might be expressing some partisan bias here. Why don't we pay you money for getting closer to the answer? And then they actually all got closer to the answer. So there's at least a danger that people are doing something different when they're answering questions than just expressing their sort of states. And it's something that I just don't know, and it's something maybe you could speak to about how people believe in conspiracy theories, or what they're doing when they say they believe in conspiracy theories, and what we're doing when we impute these beliefs to them. The other brief comment that I wanted to make, or question, has to do with your really nice discussion of the problem of defining conspiracy theories. And you reject this idea that we should just say that the conspiracy theory is just any theory or any account of a conspiracy, because that would deviate hugely from ordinary language usage. That's just not how we use the term. That's not our intuitive sense. We know one when we see one, and so on. And I think there's something, and there's something really important about that. But there's also perhaps a problem in sticking too close to everyday language. And a problem, basically, that we as researchers might uncritically reproduce the social category that we're studying. So the sort of the white-collar crime problem, you could call it. Because, white-collar crime was this term introduced by Edwin Sutherland in 1943 at the American Sociological Association, and he accused his fellow criminologists of not really counting the crimes of the wealthy and professional classes as crimes and not looking for them in the same way that they looked for the crimes of the lower classes. And so the crimes of wealthy professionals, such as businessmen and doctors, politicians and lawyers and so on, were identified differently and dealt with through different means. So they often didn't result in convictions, show up in conviction statistics and that kind of stuff. The end point of this whole process, he said, was that the criminal statistics show that crime, as popularly conceived and officially measured, has a high incidence in the lower class and a low incidence in the upper class. And his thought was, look, what we're doing is uncritically taking a category and then finding things that are associated with it. So my question, I suppose, is there a similar danger in the study of conspiracy theory? In that conspiracy theory, as popularly conceived and officially measured, we then find in our own survey research, actually, that it's associated with social exclusion, that it's associated with distance from power, and so on. And yet, this seems to be giving a pass to the paranoia of the powerful, in a way. Things that look a lot like conspiracy theories, but that aren't called conspiracy theories in everyday language, like the belief that Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11, which hits most of your buttons. It involves connecting the dots. It involves making some assertions that look unfalsifiable or that seem to constantly evade falsification. It implies implausible competence, all of these sorts of things, yet it's not called a conspiracy theory. So I suppose just a couple of questions that come from that then is that, would you then explain the paranoia of the powerful using the same repertoire of cognitive biases and so on and so on? And has anybody sort of started studying that, or is it mostly directed towards mass belief and the idea of popular delusions? And has this kind of psychological work crossed cultural boundaries? Because that would be another sort of, but maybe that's a different question entirely. And I'll just leave it there and say, let's open up to the floor. You don't have to respond to my topic immediately, but let's open up to the floor as well.
Thank you very much. Rob, would you like to respond directly first?
Sure, I can, yeah. Let me see if I can do it kind of briefly. So first you mentioned the what are the problems of survey research? Do we know, when we ask people, like, how much do you agree with this conspiracy theory on a scale of 1 to 7, from like completely disagree to completely agree, can we know that they are saying that they literally think this to be true, or is it more of like taking a position because it's an interesting position to take? And the answer is, we don't know. This is really, I think, one of the limitations of a lot of this research, because it's in its infancy. We haven't really gotten around to dealing with these kind of issues yet. And I think it is a problem, because I think there are probably a lot of people who answer in the affirmative to whether they believe a conspiracy just because they think that's kind of fun and interesting. Like I mentioned the figure of 4% of Americans say they believe that lizard people rule society, right? And that extrapolates to something like 10 or 12 million Americans, right? American adults. And I have a hard time believing that 12 million Americans literally think that lizard people rule society. I think at least some of them are just taking it as a position to take for whatever reason. And so I think it's an important direction for the research to go, is to figure out what do people mean when they reply to this. So that's work for the future. As for the issue of whether we're perpetrating stereotypes or a certain view of conspiracy theories, yeah, I think that's another problem. And I think there have been attempts to define conspiracy theories as claims that are put forward by people that are going against the position of authority, and going against the official stories. And I think that's a problem, because sometimes, as you kind of mentioned, conspiracy theories are the official explanation in kind of obvious ways. Like in Nazi Germany, the conspiracy theories about the Jewish people was pretty much the official position, or in more less obvious ways. So, for example, in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, George Bush, launched this war on terror. The way that he talked about the people who were behind these attacks showed a lot of features of conspiracism, right? Kind of painting the villains as this cohesive group of people, saying that they're over here, we can go fight them. It's a similar kind of logic to a lot of conspiracy theories, saying that there is this identifiable group of perpetrators who's behind this. We can understand them, understand what they're up to, and we can fight against them. And so yeah, again, I think it's an important perspective, but one that hasn't really begun to be addressed, at least not in the psychological literature.
Thank you. What about one of the points I've raised, which was the strange capacity of human beings to believe contradictory things?
Yeah, that's I think that's one of the most interesting studies. Like you said, it got kind of the most press. It was by Karen Douglas and another colleague of mine called Mike Wood. What they did is they found that people who think that Princess Diana killed herself, for example, are more likely to entertain the idea that she was knocked off by the British government, even though they can't both be true, right? They also looked at the death of Osama bin Laden. They conducted this research shortly after he was killed by the US government. They asked people, there were conspiracy theories that said Osama bin Laden had been dead for like a decade. He died of this obscure disease, and the government was keeping him alive as like a boogeyman. There were other people who said that bin Laden was still alive, that they hadn't really killed him. And again, the people who believed one tended to be more open to the other, even though they're contradictory. And the explanation that they put forward for this is that belief in individual conspiracy theories like bin Laden was already dead or he's still alive, it's not so much about the details of the theories themselves, it's more about how they are consistent with a more generic view of the world, a view in which official explanations are rarely true, a world in which the government is usually lying to us, not telling us the whole truth. And so they also asked people, in the bin Laden study, they asked, do you think the Obama administration is covering up some important information about the event? And once they took that question into account, the direct relationship between the contradictory conspiracy theories disappeared. It was accounted for by this higher order belief about the world in which conspiracy is just the usual explanation. Once you buy into that, any individual conspiracy theory seems more plausible, even when they contradict one another.
Okay, thank you. Right, let's sort of. Who's got a question, comment?
So is there any way to train people out of believing conspiracy theories, or is it just innate tendencies?
Well, this is, again, the research unfortunately hasn't quite gotten there. But we do know, for example, that confirmation bias, which I didn't mention in the talk, but has also been researched, is a big problem for conspiracy theories. Once you already buy into a theory, you seek out evidence that's consistent with it, any evidence that seems to go against it, you are much more, you scrutinize much more. There's also something that's been studied called the backfire effect, which is when we present somebody with evidence that explicitly contradicts their belief, shows it to be false, they don't always change their mind. Sometimes it makes them more convinced of the initial belief, which again is a particular problem for conspiracy theories because they're based on the logic that if somebody is telling you, somebody in authority especially, if they're telling you this is false, well, of course it must be true, because what are they trying to cover up? Why are they trying to mislead us, right? There must be something to it if they're even bothering to engage with it. If they're not bothering to engage with it, well, of course it's part of the cover-up, right? So it's very difficult to try and counter conspiracy theories using evidence, because they seem to be a product, at least in part, of some of these psychological biases and tendencies that are wired into our brains that affect our view of the world, all kinds of decisions and beliefs that we come to, not just conspiracy theories, they're shaping our view of the world constantly on an everyday basis. And so one study that does kind of address this question of how can we try and get people to be less receptive to conspiracy theories, they didn't use any evidence about the theories at all. What they did is they tried to get people to think in a more analytical, less intuitive way. And the way that they did that is they just used a hard-to-read font. They wrote the conspiracy theories in this kind of gray, like twirly font that was really hard to read, and they found that people who read that, the exact same claim written in that font, were less likely to buy into it than people who read it in like Arial size 12 black, like a really easy to read font. And so it seems like just struggling to read something makes us slow down, makes us question our intuition, and makes us less receptive to conspiracy theories. Whether we can put that into practice in the real world, I don't know. But yeah, again, there's more research to be done.
That fits in with Daniel Kahneman's stuff about thinking fast and thinking slow.
Exactly, yeah.
David?
One of the things you mentioned where you see these biases is where people see the randomness of, say, the stock market. And that famously, people are always looking for patterns in the random dots. They see them, you can read it, websites everywhere saying they can see these movements, this little hat, this big hat, and they think that history repeats itself. They also look for intentionality. The stock market is saying this, is communicating this. But I've always been struck by the fact they don't tend to attribute conspiracy theories to it. Actually, it's one of the striking features of contemporary conspiracy theories that people seem to be, I mean, maybe this isn't right, but my sense of it, less likely to say something like the flash crash in the stock market, where it dropped 1,000 points, which would seem to be right ground for conspiracy theory. They don't tend to attribute conspiracy theories to the movements of the stock market. Is that because there are some things that are too big, even that people have an intuitive sense that that one would be too hard to manipulate? Although actually we do have evidence that people do manipulate these markets. It's just one of those puzzles of contemporary. I wonder if you had a view.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think, you know, I would say that there are people who think that that's all a conspiracy,
Yeah, I know there are.
but it's not widespread. It's not on the level of like JFK or 9/11 and things like that. And my suspicion would be that it's just not big enough of an event in the sense that it's not striking enough. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not the same as like a presidential assassination. It doesn't get 24-hour rolling news coverage unless it's a massive recession. But people aren't thinking about it in the same way as something that's just in your face, like a disappeared airplane or a presidential assassination, things like that. And also, maybe it's just kind of confusing. Maybe it's too complex. Like an assassinated president, there's something tangible to that versus trends in the stock market. Maybe it's not intuitive enough for people to start thinking about conspiracy theories for it.
But if you just take it a bit further, I mean, maybe could it be that the stock market as such is an immensely complex system? But we did have a clear manipulation of a more specialized market, which is the LIBOR market, which was manipulated.
Yeah,
And where in the end suspicions about it turned out to be right.
yeah, it's a very interesting thing, the LIBOR thing. How few conspiracy theories there were about it. Yeah, and similarly with, you know, something even more like conspiratorial in a prototypical sense, like the NSA revelations about collecting data about people's phone records and stuff. Yeah, that's classic stuff of conspiracy, but I was kind of surprised how few people came up with conspiracy theories about it. How little talk there was. Obviously there was some, but you know, there was an outcry from people saying, look, we were right all along, as you would expect. But I think part of that is, like I said, conspiracy theories are inherently unproven, they're inherently speculative, and so once one revelation emerges, like the NSA stuff, then the conspiracy theorists move on. They say, well, of course that's true, we've been saying that all along, but what are they really not telling us? What's the next secret we're going to discover?
But even say something like was it Black Wednesday, Black Monday, Black Wednesday, when we were driven out of the ERM, which in some sense is the seminal political event in Britain in the 1990s, a more significant event than the death of Princess Diana. It did impact on people, it completely changed their view of the Conservative Party for 15 years. There was conspiratorial activity, George Soros bet heavily against the pound, but there aren't conspiracy theories about it. I mean, it is striking the things that sort of fit some of these patterns, but which don't get, and you may be right, it's because the explanatory material is there and it allows people to move on, but it's always struck me that people are much more inclined to see conspiracies outside of financial events, even though there may be more conspiracies in financial events.
Yeah, it's a good point. Again, there's more research to be done there.
Yeah.
And of course, if you look at the video of Norman Lamont emerging from the Treasury to announce that Britain was leaving the euro, on the top right-hand corner of the frame, you see a young man who's called David Cameron.
Holding an umbrella.
Okay. Yeah, you go first. Yeah.
Do you not think that this might slightly be an example of the kind of white-collar crime things? The fact that we don't really see these things that we're talking about as conspiracy theories because they're kind of widely accepted. Do you not think that this is the conspiracy theory that's the equivalent of white-collar crime, that financial conspiracy is, although widely regarded within academic circles to be legit, is actually just another conspiracy theory, and whether or not it's true, you know, there is conspiracy theorising there, and not all of it's proven maybe, but, or even when it is proven, it's still that kind of, the same kind of ideas.
Yeah.
Sorry, it wasn't very eloquent, but...
Yeah, no, I think there's, you know, maybe there's an element too of if it's right under your nose, like we all know there's white collar crime and price fixing and stuff like that, maybe it's just too obvious, it's not exciting enough. I think another important feature of conspiracy theories is that they're good stories. In the book I write about, you know, the kind of classic narratives that we like to tell and to consume, stories about good versus evil and overcoming monsters and stuff like that. And and they're about uncovering secrets. Again, they're unproven. They always want to prove something that hasn't yet been proven. And so maybe we know that people in the stock market are up to shady stuff, so it's not fun enough. It's not new enough, maybe.
Thanks, that was great.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if you've thought much about the role of media and modern digital culture kind of regarding our beliefs of conspiracy theories, and if we're more likely nowadays to believe theories because perhaps we're able to more easily access information, or online social groups or communities that also believe these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. I think undeniably the internet, social media, all that makes it easier and quicker to share conspiracy theories. And it's been argued that one of the consequences of this is that conspiracy theories have become a bit more nebulous. They don't always put forward a coherent narrative, alternative narrative of exactly what kind of conspiracy happened, who was involved, how would you explain it. They often are just asking questions. They don't have a narrative. They're just saying, I think there's more to this, right? And the internet makes that easier to do. You can just like type up a Facebook post or whatever in a second and fire it off. But as for whether this makes more people more likely to believe conspiracy theories, that surprisingly doesn't seem to be the case. Even though there's more information out there, for one thing, the internet, although it allows people to do that, it also allows people to debunk the conspiracy theories just as quickly. You know, and you can see this after every large event, like the disappearance of flight MH370 or terrorist attacks or whatever. You know, you get these conspiracy theories articles popping up immediately, but also at the same time you get these conspiracy debunking articles popping up, you know, dealing with the conspiracies, pointing out why they're not true, stuff like that. And so it doesn't seem to make more people more receptive. And in fact, there is some data on this gathered by political scientists at University of Miami, Joe Usinski, I believe spoke as part of this project a while ago, and Joseph Perrin. And what they did was they gathered data from letters to the editor that were published in newspapers over the course of like more than 100 years, from the late 1800s to early 2000s. They looked for how many letters mentioned conspiracies, and they counted them up, and they found that it was remarkably stable. People have been talking about conspiracy theories about the same amount for a period of 100 years. There were a couple of spikes, like in, I think, the late 1800s, there were a lot of fears about big business and monopolies and stuff. And in the 50s, there was the Red Scare, fears about communists infiltrating the government and stuff. But apart from that, it was pretty stable. There was no real spike after the Kennedy assassination. There was no big increase when the internet took off, or social media, or when the X-Files was on TV. It just seems to be pretty impervious to that, which makes sense from a psychological perspective. If people are responding to conspiracy theories because of these individual differences in biases that we have, it makes sense it would be pretty stable over time, and that's what seems to be the case.
Hugo?
Thanks. I was just trying to think back at this question about why financial don't lead necessarily to conspiracy theories, and I suppose I wanted to push you a bit on a question that Alfred asked you, but you didn't really respond, which was the actual nature that you attribute to conspiracy theories. Because one of the reasons you might say that financial crises, etc., don't lead. It might be the case that you can separate out different spheres, and some of them are more likely to lead to conspiracy theories. But I think one of the questions that Alfred wanted to ask you was, do you think conspiracy theories generate types of political consequences, as you seem to suggest, in terms of Hitler and the protocols of the House of Zion, or do you think it's the other way around? And the example that you have, the Dead and Alive paper, where you believe in different contradictory conspiracy theories. One other way of thinking about that is that, you know, there's this rejection of politics, or there's a rejection of the kind of official line. So if it's the case that it's politics that drive conspiracy theories and not conspiracy theories driving politics, that might explain, I wanted to hear on one hand what you thought about that, and secondly I wonder whether that's part of the answer to this question, well, why are there not conspiracy theories about financial crisis? Because it's not political directly in the same way as some of these other stories you want to tell.
Yeah, they're interesting issues. I don't know that I have the answers. In terms of the causality, I think, you know, most probably it goes both ways. Like, taking the example of Nazi Germany, there had been, you know, for a long time, these kind of German mysticism ideas about the Aryan race and the inferiority of other kinds of people, and so it had been bubbling under the surface, or sometimes on the surface, for a long time. And then the Protocols of Zion comes along and, you know, kind of brings things to a head in a lot of ways, or at least fuels them. I think, you know, a lot of people presumably bought into the protocols because it was consistent with what they already believed. But I think it quite possibly helped to fuel and perpetuate those ideas as well. I think it probably goes both ways. And I'm not sure how well we can tease that apart or answer the question of is one more important than the other, or try and quantify them. I'm not sure of the answer to that. Does that kind of answer your question?
Can you speak to the personality types that either believe or want to believe a conspiracy theory versus the kind that want to debunk it? It strikes me that belief in conspiracy theories is a defensive point of view. Someone's out to get me kind of thing, whether you believe it or not. And possibly the same for the people that try to debunk it because they get a bit morally outraged that someone is believing something that's so patently untrue, even if it isn't.
Yeah. So there's been quite a lot of research into the personality traits that correlate with believing in conspiracy theories. And a lot of the findings are, well, one of the findings is that there just aren't that many variables that seem to reliably correlate. Or putting it another way, there are quite a few variables, but all the correlations are pretty small and uninteresting, I think. The most reliable ones are with paranoia, so people who are more suspicious, a little bit more paranoid, are more likely to believe conspiracy theories, which makes perfect sense, you know, because they're predicated on a world in which people are out to get you. But I think that's often overplayed as an explanation, because the studies that have looked at paranoia and suspicion, they're not talking about like a kind of mental defect, they're not talking about pathological paranoia. They're just talking about kind of everyday suspicions, like somebody's talking about you behind your back, or like a stranger gave you a strange look. The kind of everyday suspicions that we all have from time to time. That correlates with believing conspiracy theories, but again, I think it's kind of obvious and unsurprising. One of the more surprising findings, I think, is that believing conspiracy theories correlates with open-mindedness, or at least a certain kind of open-mindedness where you're open to any kind of unorthodox explanation for things. So we also find correlations between believing conspiracy theories and believing the paranormal and new age ideas, superstitions, urban legends, things like that. And so it seems that there is a kind of mindset where if you're open-minded in that particular way, you're receptive to any unconventional explanation for things. There's a sociologist called Colin Campbell who talks about, he calls it the cultic milieu, where it's basically this, he talks about it as an intellectual underground where people basically believe anything if it goes against mainstream wisdom. And I don't really think it's fair to call it an intellectual underground. I think it's much more pervasive within society than most people realize. Everybody buys into at least some of those ideas a little bit. So those are some kind of conspiracy-prone personality types. But you mentioned a really interesting issue, which is there a personality type of conspiracy debunkers? Which hasn't really been looked at least not directly. It's obviously the other side of the coin from somebody who believes a conspiracy theory, somebody who doesn't believe. And so they tend to be less paranoid and less open-minded in that way. But it seems, at least anecdotally to me, that there is a certain kind of person, not necessarily a very pleasant or intellectually honest kind of person, who just debunks all conspiracy theories purely because they're conspiracy theories. And, you know, again, I don't think that's a very valid position. I think it's just as misguided as uncritically buying into every conspiracy theory. And, but, you know, even on my website, there's a comments section, which I never get involved in. But, you know, it's a really nice illustration of both sides of the coin. There are people who just dismiss everything that me and my co-authors write because we're government shills, you know. And there are people on the other side of the coin who just lay into the conspiracy people and call them like idiots and misguided. And yeah, it's not an intellectual position that I subscribe to or that I think is very valid.
Is there any evidence for a correlation between people who would take up conspiracy theories and people who follow religion? You would think that from your point about intentionality and the sort of primitive desire of people to see sort of conscious decisions in everything. That shares something with it.
Yeah, I think there's no data that I know of, like surveys asking about religiosity and conspiracy theories. I don't think that anything on that has been published. There has been a little bit of work in terms of a more philosophical perspective, comparing conspiracy theories as a worldview to religion as a worldview. And it makes sense, as you mentioned, some of these biases like intentionality presumably relate to religion in the sense of believing in interventionist God or miracles and things like that, pattern seeking. Yeah, so I think it makes sense that there's a link there, but I don't think that it's really been published on much yet.
The word is yet, I think. You go?
Well, sorry, Rolf and I I've done a study at YouGov, and it would suggest that yes, religious thinking is very, very important. It's not perhaps the most important, but it's certainly one of the more important things. So.
One more.
Yes. Because the title of the talk is conspiracy and democracy. Do you think that conspiracy damages democracy, or does it affect it in some way?
Yeah, so that's the title of the research project, not my talk. But I do think it's a... But it's a really interesting issue. I think, there are arguments on both sides. There's the argument that, conspiracy theories, even if they're wrong sometimes, at least they're holding authorities to account. And so maybe in that sense they're good for transparency and things like that. I don't know where I stand on that. I'm not completely sure because, at a certain point, maybe an idea is not worth entertaining anymore. But that's a risky argument as well. So I don't know. I stay on the fence when it comes to that. I think the real danger though is when conspiracy theorists get into positions of power. Like we saw in Nazi Germany and Hitler's ideas about the protocols of Zion and a Jewish world conspiracy and stuff like that. When most conspiracy theories, I think, they punch upwards. They're talking about the government and authorities, industries, things like that. And I think usually they're not too dangerous. But sometimes conspiracy theories punch downwards, like in Nazi Germany, and there's a certain presidential candidate at the moment who I'll mention no further because I don't want my green card to be revoked next year if that happens. But it's worrying. I think that's worrying. When somebody gets into a position of power and they're vilifying vulnerable people, that's when conspiracy theories become most worrying, I think, and most consequential.
So I agree that if there is no transparency, then people turn to conspiracy.
Oh yeah, I think transparency...
Some people, of course, when they have got that sort of mindset.
Absolutely, it seems to be important. And the UK and the States especially, they receive a lot of the attention when it comes to conspiracy theories because it seems like there are so many conspiracy theorists in America, especially in the UK. But when it comes to most conspiracy theories, individual theories, the conspiracy theorists are a minority. Like, the 9/11 attacks, around a third or a quarter of people usually say that they think the government knew about it in advance or the government was behind it. And that's a lot of people. That's a worrying proportion of people, but it's a minority. Most people don't buy into conspiracy theories. That's worth pointing out again. But that's not the case everywhere, especially, there's a scholar called Daniel Pipes who's written about conspiracy theories in the Middle East. And some people have talked about conspiracy theories in Russia, places where there really isn't a lot of government transparency, and conspiracy theories there, places like that, are a lot more rife, for good reason, because you don't have government transparency, you don't know what they're up to, and a lot of times they are up to no good, they are conspiring. And so sometimes it makes sense to be more conspiracy minded.
Okay, well let's leave it there. I want to thank you for a very clear, elegant and interesting presentation, for responding to questions in an open way. You're one of the few speakers who says I don't know. Thanks to Alfred for responding, and to you for coming. We have some drinks next door. Please come and join us. But in the meantime, can I ask you to help me thank both?